What would you do if saving one stranger's life meant putting your entire family in mortal danger? What if that choice had to be made in the split second between mercy and survival? Tonight's story takes us deep into the heart of Texas territory, 1883, where the nearest law was 4 days hard ride away and justice came at the end of a gun barrel. Here in a land where endless prairies stretched toward blood-red horizons and every shadow could conceal a killer, a young woman was about to discover that sometimes doing what's right is the most dangerous thing you can do. This is the tale of Rose Henderson, a 22-year-old rancher's daughter who'd learned to shoot before she could read, and Jake Morrison, a man whose true identity was buried deeper than any grave in Texas soil. When their worlds collided on a scorching afternoon that would be remembered as the day everything changed, neither could have imagined the storm brewing on the horizon. Because in the Wild West, there were no second chances for witnesses, no mercy for those who stood against powerful men, and absolutely no sanctuary for anyone who dared to fight back. Rose Henderson had always believed that a person's true character showed not in comfort, but in crisis. She was about to face the biggest crisis of her life. Picture this: a young woman riding fence line when she hears something that doesn't belong, the weak cry of a man calling for help. Following that voice across the burning prairie, she discovers a stranger with 3 bullet holes in his chest, bleeding out under the merciless sun. The smart choice would be to ride for help, to get her father and the ranch hands to stay safe. But Rose Henderson makes a different choice. She loads that wounded stranger onto her horse, tends his wounds with her own hands, and in doing so, signs her family's death warrant. Because the men hunting him aren't ordinary outlaws. They're hired killers working for cattle baron Marcus Blackwood, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way. What follows is a night of terror that will test Rose's courage like steel in a forge. She'll face impossible odds, make split-second decisions between life and death, and discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from unexpected places. The wounded stranger she saves will turn out to be more than just another drifter. He's an undercover Pinkerton detective, tracking a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of territorial government. Get ready for a story of unwavering courage, deadly betrayal, and the kind of love forged in gunfire. Because when the sun rises tomorrow, only the strong will survive. And Rose Henderson is about to prove that sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. This is a tale of the frontier where mercy was a luxury few could afford, where corruption ran deeper than oil wells, and where one woman's choice to save a stranger would spark a battle that would echo across Texas for years to come. Rose will discover that her family's ranch sits on something worth killing for, that the law itself has been bought and paid for, and that sometimes the only justice comes from the barrel of a gun. But the wounded stranger carries secrets that could destroy everything Rose holds dear. His mission isn't what it seems, his enemies aren't who they appear to be, and the conspiracy he's uncovered threatens not just the Henderson Ranch, but every honest family trying to build a life on the Texas frontier. Rose Henderson had spent her life believing in right and wrong, in protecting the innocent, in standing up to bullies no matter how powerful they were. But she's never faced enemies like these. Men who kill witnesses, burn out families, and corrupt judges with bags of silver. She's never had to choose between saving a stranger and protecting everyone she loves. Tonight, Rose will learn that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right when everything inside you screams to run. She'll discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show mercy to a wounded stranger. And she'll prove that, when powerful men try to crush the innocent, sometimes a young woman with a Winchester rifle is all that stands between justice and destruction. So settle in, because Rose's story begins on that fateful afternoon when she found a dying man on Henderson land. And everything she thought she knew about right and wrong was about to be tested by fire and blood. The real question is, what would you do if faced with Rose's choice? Because her answer is about to set the entire Texas territory ablaze. The Texas sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer on the Henderson Ranch, turning the air into something thick enough to choke on. Rose Henderson wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her leather glove and adjusted her wide-brimmed hat against the glare. August in cattle country was no time for the weak-hearted, but Rose had never been accused of weakness. At 22, she could ride, rope, and shoot as well as any man in 3 counties, and better than most. She guided her paint mare, Duchess, along the north fence line, checking for breaks in the barbed wire that kept the Henderson cattle from wandering into the Badlands, where rustlers and wild animals made their homes. The work was hot, dusty, and dangerous, but Rose preferred it to sitting in the parlor with her needlepoint like the town ladies expected. Her father, Big Jim Henderson, had raised her to be useful rather than ornamental, and she'd taken to ranch work like a duck to water. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Texas grazing land, built up over 20 years of backbreaking work and careful management. Big Jim had started with nothing but a handful of cattle and a dream, and now the Henderson brand was respected from San Antonio to the Red River. Rose was his only child, and she'd inherit every acre of it someday, assuming she lived long enough to see that day. A sound caught her attention, something that didn't belong to the familiar symphony of wind through grass and cattle lowing in the distance. Rose reined in Duchess and listened, her green eyes scanning the prairie with the sharp awareness of someone who'd learned early that, in Texas, the difference between caution and carelessness was often the difference between living and dying. There it was again, weak, desperate, human, someone calling for help. Rose's hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle in her saddle scabbard. Living on the frontier had taught her that unexpected sounds usually meant unexpected trouble, and unexpected trouble in Texas tended to be the kind that got people killed. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and Rose realized it wasn't the call of someone preparing an ambush. It was the cry of someone dying. She spurred Duchess toward the sound, following it across a small rise where the grass grew thicker near a seasonal creek bed. What she found there made her blood run cold as winter wind. A man lay sprawled in the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree, his dark clothing soaked with blood that had turned the earth beneath him into red mud. 3 bullet holes punctured his chest, arranged in a tight pattern that spoke of professional marksmanship rather than lucky shots. His face was pale as bleached bone, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that barely moved his chest. But what caught Rose's attention wasn't the wounds. She'd seen plenty of gunshot injuries in her life on the frontier. It was the quality of the man's gear. His boots were hand-tooled leather that cost more than most cowboys made in a year. His gun belt was custom work, fitted with a Colt .45 that had ivory grips and silver inlay. His clothes, though blood-soaked, were cut from fine cloth that marked him as someone with money to spend. Most telling of all was the horse standing nearby, a magnificent black stallion with a saddle worth more than most men's annual wages. This wasn't some drifting cowboy who'd run afoul of rustlers. This was a man of substance, someone important enough to attract the attention of professional killers. Rose dismounted and approached cautiously, her rifle ready. The man could be anyone, an outlaw, a gambler, a traveling salesman who'd crossed the wrong people. But as she knelt beside him and saw his face clearly for the first time, something inside her chest tightened with unexpected emotion. He was young, maybe 30, with strong, honest features that spoke of character rather than cruelty. Even unconscious and dying, there was something noble about him, something that reminded her of her father during his army days. This was a man who stood for something, who fought for principles, even when principles fought back. "Mister," she called softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the mesquite branches. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, deep brown eyes clouded with agony but still alert, still aware. When he saw her leaning over him, relief flooded his features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Rose found herself staring into those eyes, seeing intelligence, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice barely audible, rough with pain and blood loss. "Thank God. I thought I was going to die alone out here." Rose's mind raced as she assessed his condition. The bullets had gone deep, but they'd missed his heart and lungs by inches. He was losing blood fast, and fever was already building behind his eyes, but the wounds weren't immediately fatal. Whatever this man had done, whoever was after him, he was dying by degrees rather than minutes. "You're not going to die," she said firmly, already beginning to strip cloth from her shirt to make bandages. "Not on my watch. I'm going to get you to our ranch house." The man's eyes widened with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "Ma'am, you don't understand. They, the men who did this, they'll be coming back. If they find you helping me, then we better make sure they don't find us," Rose interrupted, already working to fashion a makeshift stretcher from mesquite branches and her rope. "What's your name, mister?" "Jake," he whispered. "Jake Morrison. And ma'am, I need you to know, helping me might just get you and your family killed." Rose looked at him steadily as she worked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Jake Morrison," she repeated. "I'm Rose Henderson, and this is Henderson land you're bleeding on. My daddy taught me that when someone needs help on our property, we provide it. Whatever trouble you brought with you, we'll handle it when it comes." But even as she spoke the words with confidence, Rose had no idea that saving Jake Morrison's life had just signed her family's death warrant. Because somewhere in these same Badlands, 6 hired killers were following a blood trail, and they'd burn down anyone who stood between them and their prey. As she began carefully loading Jake onto the makeshift stretcher, being mindful of his wounds, the sun was already sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Darkness was coming fast to the Texas plains, and with it would come the hunters who'd stop at nothing to silence their quarry forever. "Henderson Ranch," Jake muttered deliriously as Rose secured him to the stretcher. They know about Henderson Ranch." Rose's blood turned to ice. Jake Morrison knew her family's name, knew their ranch. But how? And why were professional killers hunting a man who seemed to know more about her family than he was letting on? The real mystery was just beginning, and Rose Henderson was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show mercy to a wounded stranger, especially when that stranger carries secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. As she began the careful journey back to the ranch house, Jake's fevered mutterings filled her ears with fragments of conspiracy and corruption that made no sense. But one phrase kept repeating over and over, like a curse or a warning. "They know about the Henderson Ranch. They know about the silver." Silver? Rose's heart pounded as the implications hit her. Her family had always wondered why cattle baron Marcus Blackwood kept making offers to buy their land. Offers that got more aggressive with each rejection. Now she was beginning to understand. The Henderson Ranch wasn't just valuable for its grazing land. It was valuable for what lay beneath it. And Jake Morrison, whoever he really was, had somehow discovered that secret. The question was, would he live long enough to explain it? And more importantly, would any of them live long enough to do anything about it? Getting Jake Morrison to the Henderson Ranch house nearly killed them both. Rose had to move slowly across the rough terrain, every jolt of the makeshift stretcher drawing gasps of pain from Jake that made her wince in sympathy. But the alternative was leaving him to die under that mesquite tree, and Rose Henderson had never walked away from someone in need, no matter the personal cost. The ranch house came into view just as the sun touched the western horizon, a solid 2-story structure built from native stone and timber that had weathered 20 years of Texas storms. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney, and Rose could see the warm glow of lamplight in the windows. Home had never looked more welcoming or more vulnerable than it did at that moment. Big Jim Henderson emerged from the barn as Rose guided Duchess and her burden into the yard, his weathered face creased with concern. At 55, Jim Henderson was still a formidable man, broad-shouldered and strong, with the kind of presence that commanded respect from cowboys and cattle barons alike. But when he saw his daughter returning with a blood-soaked stranger, his expression shifted from concern to the cold alertness of a man who'd survived Indian raids and cattle wars. "Rose, what in tarnation?" he began, then stopped as he got a closer look at Jake's wounds. 3 bullets. Professional work. Get him inside, quick." Between Rose and her father, they managed to carry Jake into the house and up to the spare bedroom, where Rose's mother, Margaret Henderson, was already preparing hot water and clean bandages with the efficient calm of a woman who'd tended plenty of gunshot wounds in her time on the frontier. At 48, Margaret was still a handsome woman with prematurely gray hair and Rose's same green eyes, but there was steel beneath her gentle exterior. "Who is he?" Margaret asked as she began cutting away Jake's blood-soaked shirt, revealing the full extent of his injuries. "Says his name is Jake Morrison," Rose replied, helping to clean the wounds. Found him shot up near the north fence line. Mom, these aren't random shots. Someone wanted him dead, but they wanted him to suffer first. Jim examined Jake's gun belt and saddle, his experienced eye taking in details that told their own story. This gear cost more than most cowboys make in 5 years. Whoever this man is, he's got money behind him. Question is, what kind of money? As they worked to clean and bandage Jake's wounds, he drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragments of conversation that made less and less sense. But Rose caught enough words to piece together a troubling picture. Blackwood, buying judges, Henderson Silver, have to stop them. When Jake finally fell into a deep, fever-driven sleep, Rose found herself going through his saddlebags with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that information could mean the difference between life and death. What she found made her blood run cold as January wind. The leather portfolio contained documents that would have been worth a fortune to the right buyer, or a death sentence to the wrong one. Jake Morrison wasn't just another well-dressed traveler. He was a Pinkerton detective, and he'd been investigating a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of Texas territorial politics. The papers detailed a network of corruption that made Rose's stomach churn. Cattle Baron Marcus Blackwood hadn't built his empire through honest business practices. He'd been systematically buying judges, sheriffs, and territorial officials, using his wealth and influence to force honest ranchers off their land through legal manipulation and outright intimidation. But the most damning document was a geological survey that made Rose's hands tremble as she read it. The Henderson Ranch didn't just sit on prime grazing land. It was positioned directly over one of the largest silver veins ever discovered in Texas. The survey estimated the deposit's value at over $2 million, enough money to make Marcus Blackwood the most powerful man west of the Mississippi. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Big Jim breathed when Rose showed him the papers. No wonder Blackwood's been so persistent about buying our land. He's not after our cattle. He's after what's underneath them. Margaret looked up from checking Jake's bandages, her face pale but determined. How long has he known? According to these documents, at least 6 months, Rose said, pointing to a surveyor's report dated the previous February. He's been positioning himself to claim our land legally, but when that didn't work, he decided to take it by force, Jim finished grimly, and this Pinkerton detective got too close to the truth. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake's eyes fluttered open, clearer now than they'd been since Rose found him. His gaze immediately went to the papers in Rose's hands, and she saw a mixture of relief and terror across his features. You read them, he said, his voice stronger but still rough with pain. Then you know what we're up against. We? Rose asked, though something in her chest tightened at the word. She'd already committed herself to Jake's cause by saving his life, but hearing him include her in his mission made it real in a way that frightened and thrilled her at the same time. Jake struggled to sit up, waving away Margaret's attempts to keep him flat. Miss Henderson, Rose, I need you to understand something. I'm not just a Pinkerton detective investigating corruption. I'm the only man who can prove that Marcus Blackwood murdered 17 people to build his empire. The number hit Rose like a physical blow. 17 people, men, women, maybe even children, killed to satisfy one man's greed. The families who refused to sell, Jake continued, his eyes burning with fever and determination. The officials who couldn't be bought, the witnesses who saw too much. Blackwood's had them all killed, and he's made it look like accidents, Indian raids, or outlaw attacks. The perfect crimes. But you have proof, Jim said, studying Jake's face with the sharp attention of a man evaluating potential allies and enemies. I had proof, Jake corrected grimly. 3 witnesses who were willing to testify against Blackwood in federal court. All 3 are dead now, killed within the last month. I'm the only one left who knows the whole truth, and Blackwood's hired killers have been hunting me across 2 states. Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze coming through the windows. That's why they shot you, to stop you from testifying. They didn't just want to stop me, Jake said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They wanted to make sure I suffered first. Blackwood doesn't just kill his enemies, he makes examples of them. The implications crashed over Rose like a flash flood. By saving Jake, by bringing him to their ranch, she'd painted a target on her entire family. Blackwood's killers would come, and they wouldn't just be hunting Jake anymore. They'd be hunting anyone who'd helped him. "How many men does Blackwood have?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "At least a dozen professional killers," Jake replied. "Maybe more." "They're not ordinary cowboys or rustlers, Rose. These are men who kill for money, and they're very good at what they do." Big Jim checked his rifle with the methodical calm of a man who'd faced down hostile Indians and cattle rustlers. "Then we better get ready for company. How long before they track you here?" "They'll follow the blood trail," Jake said, trying to stand and immediately falling back with a gasp of pain. "Could be tonight, could be dawn, but they will come." Rose looked at her parents, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. The Hendersons had carved a life out of hostile country through courage and stubbornness, and they weren't about to let Marcus Blackwood's hired killers run them off their own land. "Then we'll be ready for them," she said firmly, moving to the gun cabinet where her father kept the family's weapons. "We've got rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the home advantage. Let them come." But even as she spoke the words with confidence, Rose knew they were facing odds that would challenge even the toughest frontier family. Jake was wounded and weak, useful in a fight, but not at full strength. Her parents were tough and experienced, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Still, there was something else building in the room as they prepared for the coming battle. Something that went beyond simple alliance or mutual defense. When Rose looked at Jake Morrison, she saw more than just a wounded Pinkerton detective. She saw a man who'd risked everything to expose corruption and protect innocent people. Someone who shared her father's sense of justice and her own determination to stand up for what was right. And when Jake looked at Rose, she could see something similar in his eyes. Not just gratitude for saving his life, but admiration for her courage, respect for her strength, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge yet. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment like a gunshot through glass. Rose moved to the window and peered through the curtains, counting riders silhouetted against the dying light. 6 men, all mounted and armed, spreading out to surround the ranch house with the coordinated precision of professionals who'd done this kind of work before. "They're here," she said quietly, reaching for her Winchester. Jake struggled to his feet, swaying but determined, his Colt .45 steady in his hand despite his injuries. "Rose, I need you to know something before this starts. Meeting you, having you save my life, it's been an honor. You're the bravest person I've ever known." Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his eyes steadily. "Save the pretty words for when we're both still breathing, Detective Morrison. We've got a fight to win first." Outside, a voice called through the gathering darkness, smooth and confident, and deadly as a rattlesnake's hiss. "Jake Morrison, we know you're in there, boy. Come on out, and we'll make this quick and clean. No need for innocent folks to get hurt." Rose's finger tightened on her rifle's trigger. Marcus Blackwood's killers had found them, but they were about to learn that the Henderson family didn't intimidate easily. The real battle was about to begin, and Rose Henderson intended to show these hired guns that some things were worth fighting for: justice, family, and the wounded stranger who'd brought both danger and something that might be love into her life. But little did she know, the men surrounding her home weren't just there to kill Jake Morrison. They'd been sent to eliminate anyone who might have learned Blackwood's secrets. The Henderson Ranch was about to become a battlefield, and only the strongest would see another sunrise. The voice that drifted across the Henderson Ranch yard carried the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with murder. Rose peered through the bedroom window, counting shadows moving between the outbuildings with the coordinated precision of men who'd done this work before. 6 riders had become 6 killers on foot, positioning themselves to cover every possible escape route from the ranch house. "Jake Morrison," the voice called again, smoother than whiskey and twice as poisonous. "I'm Cole Brennan, and I work for Mr. Marcus Blackwood. You've got something that belongs to him, and we've come to collect it." Rose recognized the name from Jake's documents. Cole Brennan, Blackwood's chief enforcer, a man rumored to have killed more people than cholera. He was the kind of professional killer who'd shoot a man's family just to make a point, and he was standing in her front yard making demands. "This is Henderson land," Big Jim called back through the front door, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never backed down from a fight in his life. "You boys best move along before you find more trouble than you bargained for." Brennan's laughter echoed across the yard like the rattle of bones in a tin cup. "Mr. Henderson, I admire a man who stands up for his property, but you're harboring a fugitive, and that makes this federal business. Hand over Morrison and the documents he stole, and we'll ride away peaceful-like." Rose exchanged glances with Jake, who was propped against the bedroom wall with his Colt in his trembling hands. His face was still pale from blood loss, but his eyes burned with the fever of a man who knew he was fighting for more than just his own life. "They won't honor any deal," he whispered. "Brennan's orders are to kill everyone who might have seen those documents. That includes all of you." Rose had expected as much. Men like Marcus Blackwood didn't build empires by leaving witnesses alive, but hearing it confirmed sent ice water through her veins. This wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be a massacre unless the Hendersons proved tougher prey than Brennan expected. "Ma, get to the kitchen where you can watch the back door," Rose said quietly, checking the loads in her Winchester. "Pa, take the front parlor. I'll stay up here with Jake and cover the side windows." Margaret Henderson nodded grimly and disappeared downstairs with her husband's spare rifle. At 48, she could still shoot the eye out of a rattlesnake at 50 yards, and she'd proven her courage during the Indian troubles 5 years past. Big Jim positioned himself by the front windows where his Henry rifle could command the entire front yard. The ranch house had been built with defense in mind: thick stone walls that could stop most bullets, small windows that were easy to defend, and clear fields of fire in all directions. The Hendersons had learned hard lessons during their early years in Texas, and they'd built accordingly. "Time's up, Morrison." Brennan's voice carried a sharper edge now. "You've got 10 seconds to walk out that door, or we'll burn you out." "Let them try," Rose muttered, settling into position by the side window. She'd helped her father build this house, and she knew every advantage it offered. The roof was slate, not wood, making it nearly impossible to burn. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, solid enough to turn rifle bullets, and the well was inside the root cellar, meaning they could hold out for days if necessary. But Brennan's next words chilled her to the bone. "Torch the barn, boys. Let's show these folks we mean business." Rose watched in horror as 2 of Brennan's men approached the barn carrying burning brands. Inside were the Hendersons' prize horses, including Duchess, who'd carried Rose on countless rides across the prairie. More importantly, the barn held feed for their cattle and supplies they'd need to survive the coming winter. "Bastards," Jake breathed, trying to stand and immediately falling back with a gasp of pain. "They're not just trying to flush us out, they're trying to destroy your livelihood." Rose's finger tightened on her rifle trigger as she watched the killers prepare to torch her family's barn. But before she could fire, Big Jim's Henry rifle boomed from downstairs, and one of the men with a torch spun around and collapsed, clutching his shoulder. "Next man who tries to burn my property gets it between the eyes." Jim's voice carried across the yard with the authority of a man who'd never made an idle threat. The response was immediate and overwhelming. All 6 of Brennan's men opened fire simultaneously, their bullets shattering windows and punching holes in the thick stone walls. Rose ducked as glass exploded around her, then popped up and returned fire with her Winchester, working the lever with practiced speed. Her first shot caught one of the gunmen in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed behind a water trough. Her second shot splintered the wooden post he'd been using for cover, sending his partner diving for better protection behind the blacksmith shed. From downstairs, she could hear the steady boom of her father's rifle as he held the front of the house, and the sharp crack of her mother's weapon as she defended the kitchen. The Hendersons were outnumbered, but they were fighting on their own ground with weapons they knew like old friends. "Rose!" Jake called out, pointing toward the side yard where 2 more gunmen were trying to flank the house. "Left side, behind the well." Rose swung her rifle around and caught sight of movement just as one of the men broke cover. Her shot took him high in the shoulder, but he managed to dive behind the stone well house before she could finish him. His partner laid down covering fire, bullets whining through the broken window and embedding themselves in the far wall. "How many rounds you got left?" Jake asked, reloading his Colt with hands that shook from fever and blood loss. "Plenty," Rose replied, though she was already down to half her ammunition. She'd counted 20 shots fired, and she had maybe 30 rounds left between her rifle and the spare ammunition in her gun belt. Not enough for a prolonged siege, but enough to make Brennan's men pay dearly for every inch they gained. The gunfire settled into a deadly rhythm. Short bursts of shooting followed by tense silence as both sides repositioned and looked for advantages. Rose found herself falling into the familiar pattern of frontier combat. Aim, fire, move to a new position, reload, and wait for the next opportunity. But she could see that Brennan was learning from each exchange. His men were professional killers, and they adapted their tactics as the fight progressed. They'd stopped trying to rush the house directly and were now working to establish better firing positions, using the outbuildings for cover as they closed in. "They're trying to get close enough to throw dynamite," Jake observed, his voice steady despite his wounds. "Brennan's got a reputation for using explosives when bullets don't work." Rose's blood ran cold. Dynamite would turn their stone fortress into a tomb, and there wouldn't be enough left of any of them to bury properly. But as she watched Brennan's men maneuvering in the growing darkness, she realized something that might give them an advantage. "They don't know the ranch layout as well as we do," she said, a plan forming in her mind. "Pa built drainage ditches along the north side for the spring runoff. They're deep enough for a person to crawl through, and they lead right behind the blacksmith shop." Jake's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're talking about going on the offensive." "I'm talking about evening the odds," Rose corrected, checking her rifle one more time. "You keep them busy from here. I'm going to give Brennan something to really worry about." Before Jake could protest, Rose was moving, slipping out of the bedroom and down the stairs with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent her life moving quietly through dangerous country. She found her father reloading by the front window, his face grim but determined. "Pa, I'm going out through the root cellar," she whispered. "Give me 5 minutes, then put as many shots as you can into the blacksmith shop. Make them keep their heads down." Big Jim's weathered face creased with worry, but he nodded. He'd raised his daughter to be tough and smart, and he trusted her judgment even in circumstances like these. "You be careful, Rose. Your ma and I didn't survive 20 years in Texas just to lose you to hired killers." Rose slipped into the root cellar through the trap door in the kitchen floor, past shelves lined with preserved food and winter supplies. The tunnel her father had dug for emergency water access during the dry years led out beyond the well house, emerging in a thicket of mesquite that provided perfect cover. The night air was cool against her skin as she crawled through the drainage ditch, her rifle held carefully to avoid catching on the rough stone sides. She could hear Brennan's men moving in the darkness ahead, their voices low and confident as they prepared for what they thought would be the final assault. Rose emerged behind the blacksmith shop just as her father's rifle opened up from the house, the steady boom of his Henry providing the distraction she needed. She could see 2 of Brennan's men crouch behind her father's anvil, completely focused on the muzzle flashes from the ranch house. Her first shot took the nearest man in the back, dropping him before he could cry out a warning. The second man spun around, his eyes wide with shock as he realized their prey had become the hunter. Rose's Winchester spoke again, and Cole Brennan was suddenly down 2 more men. The tables had turned, and Rose Henderson was about to show these hired killers that some people were a lot more dangerous than they appeared. The real battle was just beginning, and the outcome was far from certain. But as she repositioned for her next shot, Rose heard something that made her blood freeze, the distinctive hiss of a lit dynamite fuse somewhere in the darkness ahead. Brennan had decided to end this siege permanently, and Rose had maybe 30 seconds before her family's ranch house became a crater in the Texas prairie. The hiss of the burning dynamite fuse cut through the night air like the rattle of death itself. Rose Henderson had maybe 20 seconds before her family's ranch house became a smoking crater, and the man with the dynamite was hidden somewhere in the darkness beyond the blacksmith shop. 20 seconds to find him, stop him, and save everyone she'd ever loved. She moved through the shadows with the fluid grace of a predator, her Winchester held ready as she followed the sound of that deadly fuse. Years of hunting in these same hills had taught her to move silently, to track by sound and instinct, to think like prey when she needed to become the hunter. There, behind the water trough, A dark figure crouched with something cylindrical in his hands. Rose could see the red spark of the fuse. Maybe 10 seconds left before the explosion that would end everything. She raised her rifle, took careful aim despite the darkness and the pounding of her heart, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's boom echoed across the ranch yard, and the man with the dynamite jerked backward, his throw going wild as Rose's bullet caught him in the shoulder. The dynamite sailed harmlessly into the open pasture, where it exploded in a flash of light and thunder that lit up the night sky, but hurt nothing more than prairie grass. "Son of a bitch!" Cole Brennan's voice roared from somewhere near the barn. "She's behind us! Johnson's down!" Rose was already moving, using the confusion caused by the explosion to relocate before Brennan's remaining men could pin down her position. She'd learned from her father that in a gunfight, the side that kept moving usually won, and standing still in one place was the quickest way to get killed. From the ranch house, she could hear Jake's Colt barking as he covered her movement, his shots forcing Brennan's men to keep their heads down. Despite his wounds, the Pinkerton detective was proving himself a valuable ally, and Rose felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of battle. But her satisfaction at stopping the dynamite was short-lived. As the echoes of the explosion faded, she could hear new sounds in the distance, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. More riders were coming, and from the sound of it, there were a lot of them. "Brennan," a voice called from the darkness beyond the ranch buildings. "Marcus Blackwood himself, and it looks like you boys have made a mess of things." Rose's blood turned to ice as she recognized the name. Marcus Blackwood had come personally to oversee the destruction of her family. The cattle baron who'd built his empire on blood and corruption was here to finish the job his hired killers had started. Through the broken windows of the ranch house, she could see lamplight flickering as her parents maintained their positions. They'd heard the new arrivals too, and she knew they were counting enemies, just like she was. The original 6 killers were down to 3 or 4 effectives, but now there were at least 8 new riders surrounding the property. "Mr. Blackwood," Brennan called back, his voice tight with embarrassment and rage. "The Hendersons are putting up more of a fight than we expected. And the girl, she's been picking off my men like they were tin cans on a fence post." Blackwood's laughter carried no warmth, only the cold amusement of a man who'd crushed stronger opposition than one ranch family. "The girl? Cole, are you telling me that one rancher's daughter has been outfighting your professional killers?" Rose felt anger surge through her like wildfire. These men thought of her as just the girl, some helpless frontier woman to be brushed aside like a troublesome insect. They were about to learn that Rose Henderson was a lot more dangerous than they'd bargained for. She worked her way around to the north side of the property, where the new arrivals were positioning themselves. Through the darkness, she could make out a large man on horseback, clearly giving orders to the riders spreading out around him. Marcus Blackwood himself, the man whose greed had brought death to her family's doorstep. Rose had a clear shot, 50 yards, good light from the stars. Her Winchester zeroed perfectly for that range. She could end this whole thing right now with one well-placed bullet. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she drew a bead on the cattle baron's broad chest. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was her father's teachings about honor and fair play, or her mother's lessons about the difference between justice and murder. Marcus Blackwood was a killer and a thief, but shooting him from ambush felt like becoming the same kind of person he was. That moment of hesitation nearly cost Rose her life. "There she is!" one of Blackwood's men shouted, and suddenly the night exploded with muzzle flashes as half a dozen rifles opened fire in her direction. Rose dove for cover behind a pile of split firewood as bullets whined over her head and thudded into the logs around her. "You should have taken the shot, girl," Blackwood's voice boomed across the ranch yard, and Rose could hear the mockery in it. "Mercy is a luxury you can't afford out here." Rose worked her way deeper into the woodpile, using the stacked logs for cover as she tried to find a new firing position. But Blackwood's men were professionals, and they'd learned from Brennan's mistakes. They were advancing in coordinated fashion, covering each other's movements as they closed in on her position. A bullet splintered the log inches from her head, and Rose realized she was trapped. Too many guns, too many angles of attack. She needed to get back to the ranch house where she could support her family's defense, but 20 yards of open ground lay between her and the nearest cover. That's when Jake Morrison proved why Pinkerton detectives were worth their reputation. The wounded detective appeared at the ranch house's side door, moving with painful determination despite his injuries. His Colt spoke 6 times in rapid succession, each shot carefully aimed to provide maximum distraction. 2 of Blackwood's men went down, and the others dove for cover, giving Rose the opening she needed. She sprinted across the open ground like her life depended on it, which it did, reaching the ranch house just as Jake collapsed against the doorframe, his face gray with exhaustion and blood loss. "You came back for me," she panted, helping him inside. "Partners don't leave partners behind," Jake replied. And something in the way he said it made Rose's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with the running. But their moment of connection was shattered by Marcus Blackwood's voice booming across the ranch yard, amplified by a speaking trumpet that made his words carry like the voice of judgment itself. "Henderson, I know you can hear me in there. You're harboring a federal fugitive, and that makes you accessories to his crimes. But I'm a reasonable man, and I'm prepared to make you a deal." Big Jim's voice answered from the front parlor, steady as granite, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "The only deal I'm interested in is you getting off my property, Blackwood. Come now, Jim. We've known each other for years. I've made you fair offers for this land, more than generous offers. All you had to do was take the money and relocate somewhere safer. This land has been in my family for 20 years, Jim shot back. "It'll stay in my family until I'm dead and buried." "That can be arranged," Blackwood replied, and the casual way he said it sent chills down Rose's spine. "But it doesn't have to come to that. Hand over Morrison and the documents he stole, and I'll let you and your family ride away. You've got my word as a gentleman." Rose caught Jake's eye and saw her own thoughts reflected there. Marcus Blackwood's word wasn't worth the air it took to speak it. Even if they surrendered, even if they gave him everything he wanted, the cattle baron couldn't afford to leave witnesses alive. The Henderson family knew too much about his crimes to ever be allowed to leave this ranch alive. "What do you think?" she whispered to Jake. "I think he's stalling for time while his men get into better positions," Jake replied grimly. "Look out the back window." Rose peered through the kitchen curtains and felt her stomach drop. More riders were approaching from the south, at least 6 additional men with torches and what looked like more dynamite. Blackwood had brought an army to crush one ranch family, and he was positioning them for a final, overwhelming assault. "How many is that total?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. 16, maybe 18 men, Jake calculated, checking the cylinder of his Colt. All professional killers, all loyal to Blackwood's money. The odds were impossible, but Rose Henderson had never been one to give up when the situation looked hopeless. If Marcus Blackwood wanted a fight, she'd give him one he'd never forget, even if it was the last thing she ever did. "Pa!" she called to her father. "Ma, time to make our stand." From outside, Blackwood's voice came again, and this time it carried the finality of an executioner's pronouncement. "Time's up, Henderson. Boys, burn them out, and make sure nobody escapes alive." The night sky lit up with torches as Blackwood's army prepared for the final assault. Rose Henderson was about to face the fight of her life, outnumbered 18-4, with a wounded detective, aging parents, and nothing but courage and stubbornness to even the odds. But as she checked her Winchester one more time and took position beside Jake at the side window, Rose realized something that gave her strength. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for justice, for the memory of 17 innocent people Marcus Blackwood had murdered, and for the wounded stranger who'd shown her what it meant to stand up for what was right no matter the cost. The real battle was about to begin, and Rose Henderson intended to show Marcus Blackwood that some people were worth more than all his money and hired guns combined. Little did she know, the cattle baron had one more surprise in store. A secret about the Henderson ranch that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's legacy. The torches came through the darkness like falling stars, arcing through the night air toward the Henderson ranch house with deadly purpose. Rose pressed herself against the stone wall as the first one crashed through the front window, spreading burning kerosene across her mother's carefully polished wooden floor. The second torch hit the kitchen, and the third smashed against the side wall where the flames licked hungrily at the wooden window frame. "They're trying to smoke us out," Big Jim called from the front parlor, his voice tight with the kind of controlled fury that came from watching strangers try to destroy everything he'd spent 20 years building. Rose grabbed a bucket of water from the kitchen pump and doused the flames spreading across the floor. But she knew it was only a temporary solution. With 18 men surrounding the house and unlimited torches at their disposal, Marcus Blackwood could keep this up all night until the Henderson family was forced to choose between burning alive or running into a crossfire that would cut them down like wheat before a scythe. "There's something else," Jake said urgently, struggling to reload his Colt with hands that shook from fever and blood loss. "Something about this ranch that Blackwood didn't put in those documents. Something he's been keeping secret even from his own men." Another torch crashed through the bedroom window, and Rose beat out the flames with a wet blanket while Jake continued talking, his voice growing stronger as adrenaline fought against his injuries. "I've been investigating Blackwood for 8 months, following his money trail, tracking his land acquisitions. Every property he's stolen has been chosen for a specific reason: water rights, railroad access, mineral deposits. But the Henderson Ranch doesn't fit the pattern." Rose paused in her firefighting, something cold settling in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "The geological survey in his files shows silver deposits worth maybe $2 million, Jake explained, wincing as another bullet shattered what remained of the side window. "That's a lot of money, but not enough to justify this kind of operation. Blackwood spent more on hired killers in the last 6 months than he'd make from that silver vein." Through the broken windows, Rose could hear Blackwood's voice booming across the ranch yard, directing his men like a general positioning troops for a final assault. But there was something else in his tone now, something that sounded almost like desperation. "Then what's he really after?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything she thought she understood about her family's land. Jake pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket, something he'd obviously been saving for the right moment. "I found this in Blackwood's private safe 2 weeks ago, just before his men caught up with me. It's a federal geological survey, classified at the territorial level." Rose unfolded the paper and felt the world tilt around her as she read. The Henderson Ranch didn't just sit on a silver vein. It was positioned directly over the largest oil deposit ever discovered in North America. According to the survey, the estimated value was over $50 million, enough money to make Marcus Blackwood richer than railroad barons and cattle kings combined. $50 million, she breathed, the number almost too large to comprehend. "Oil is the future, Rose," Jake said urgently. "In 10 years, maybe 20, it'll be more valuable than gold. And your family's ranch sits right on top of what might be the biggest strike in history." The implications crashed over Rose like a flash flood. No wonder Blackwood had been so persistent, so willing to murder entire families to get their land. This wasn't just about greed. It was about controlling a resource that would reshape the entire American economy. "He killed 17 people for this," she said, her voice flat with the kind of rage that burned cold and deep. "And he'll kill 17 more if that's what it takes," Jake replied. "That's why we can't let him win, Rose. It's not just about your family anymore. It's about stopping a man who turned the entire territory into his personal kingdom." Outside, the torches had stopped flying, replaced by something that made Rose's blood run even colder. She could hear the distinctive sound of men digging, the scrape of shovels against hard earth, and the low voices of workers following shouted instructions. "What are they doing?" she asked, peering through the smoke-stained window. Jake's face went gray as he realized what the sounds meant. "They're digging trenches, siege lines. Blackwood's not trying to burn us out anymore. He's settling in for a long fight." The cattle baron's voice confirmed Jake's fears, booming across the ranch yard with renewed confidence. "Henderson, I know you've figured out what your land is really worth by now. $50 million in oil, just waiting to be pumped out of the ground. That's more money than your family could spend in 10 lifetimes." Big Jim's voice answered from the front of the house, steady despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "It's still our land, Blackwood, and it'll stay our land until you kill every last one of us." "That can be arranged," Blackwood replied, and Rose could hear the smile in his voice. "But first, I want you to understand something about your precious ranch, about the real reason I need it so badly." What came next made Rose's knees weak with shock. "You see, Jim, that oil deposit doesn't just sit under your property. It extends east and south under my ranch and the Watsons spread in half a dozen other properties I've already acquired. But the main wellhead, the place where the drilling needs to start, that's right under your barn. Without access to Henderson land, that $50 million might as well be on the moon." Rose felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. Blackwood hadn't just been buying land randomly. He'd been systematically acquiring every property connected to the oil field, using murder and legal manipulation to assemble what would become the largest oil operation in American history. The Henderson Ranch was the keystone of the entire scheme. "Which means," Jake said grimly, "he can't afford to let any of us live. We know too much about his methods, and we're sitting on the one piece of land he absolutely has to have." Another sound reached Rose's ears, the rhythmic thudding of axes biting into wood. Blackwood's men were cutting down trees, building fortifications for a siege that could last days or even weeks. The cattle baron had the resources to wait them out, and he had enough men to maintain a complete perimeter around the ranch house. "We can't win a defensive fight," Rose realized. "He's got too many men, too many supplies, and all the time in the world." "Then we don't fight defensively," Jake said, and despite his wounds, his voice carried the steel determination that had made him one of the Pinkerton Agency's best detectives. "We take the fight to him." Rose stared at him in amazement. "Jake, you can barely stand up, and we're outnumbered 18-4. How exactly do you propose we go on the offensive?" Jake's smile was grim but determined. "Because Marcus Blackwood made a mistake. He brought all his men here, to this ranch at the same time, which means his own property is undefended. And more importantly, his private papers, the ones that prove his involvement in 17 murders, are sitting in his ranch house, safe, just waiting for someone to liberate them." The plan was insane, desperate, and probably suicidal. It was also their only chance. "You're talking about leaving my parents here alone," Rose said, though she could already see the tactical sense in Jake's suggestion. "Your parents are tough, and they know this ground better than anyone," Jake replied. "They can hold the house for a few hours, especially if Blackwood thinks we're still trapped inside. Meanwhile, we circle around, hit his ranch, get the evidence that'll bring down his entire network." From the front parlor, Big Jim's voice called out with urgent alarm. "Rose, Jake, they're bringing up something big." Rose peered through the window and felt her heart sink. Blackwood's men were positioning what looked like a small cannon, the kind of field piece used in the territorial wars. One shot from that weapon would turn the stone ranch house into rubble, ending the siege in a matter of seconds. "Time's running out," Jake said. "We have to move now, or we're all dead by morning." Rose looked at her wounded partner, then at the impossible odds they faced, then at the cannon being loaded with grape shot that would shred anyone caught in the open. The smart choice was to surrender, to hope that Blackwood would honor his word about a quick death. But Rose Henderson had never made the smart choice when the right choice was available. "Ma, Pa," she called to her parents. "Jake and I are going out the back. Hold them here for 2 hours, then surrender if you have to. We'll be back with help." "The hell you will," Margaret Henderson's voice carried from the kitchen, sharp with maternal authority. "You're not leaving this house while there are killers outside." "Ma, it's the only way," Rose replied, already gathering ammunition and supplies for what might be her last ride. "Trust me." Big Jim's voice was heavy with the weight of a father watching his daughter ride into mortal danger. "You come back to us, Rose Henderson. You hear me? You come back." "I will, Pa," Rose promised, though she had no idea if it was a promise she could keep. As she and Jake prepared to slip out through the root cellar tunnel, Rose realized that everything in her life had led to this moment. All her father's lessons about courage and justice, all her mother's teachings about standing up for what was right, all her own experiences learning to survive in hostile country. In the next few hours, she would either expose the conspiracy that had cost 17 innocent people their lives, or she would join them in whatever justice waited beyond the grave. But as she looked at Jake Morrison, seeing the determination burning in his eyes despite his wounds, Rose knew she wasn't facing this fight alone anymore. They were partners now, bound together by shared danger and something deeper that neither of them had time to examine. And together they were going to give Marcus Blackwood the fight of his life. The night air was crisp against Rose's face as she and Jake emerged from the drainage tunnel a quarter-mile from the ranch house. Behind them, the Henderson property glowed with the light of torches and campfires as Marcus Blackwood's army settled in for what they believed would be a siege lasting until dawn. Ahead lay 12 miles of rough country and the most dangerous ride of Rose Henderson's life. Jake swayed in his saddle, his face gray with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with the kind of determination that had made him one of the Pinkerton Agency's most effective detectives. Rose had saddled two of her fastest horses, including Duchess, whose sure footing and speed had carried her safely across a dangerous country more times than she could count. "You sure you can make this ride?" Rose asked, studying Jake's wounds with concern. He'd lost a lot of blood, and the fever in his eyes spoke of infection setting in, despite her careful nursing. "I'll make it," Jake replied grimly. "Too many people have died for Blackwood's greed. I won't let their deaths be meaningless." They rode hard through the darkness, following cattle trails and creek beds that Rose had known since childhood. The Blackwood Ranch lay to the southeast, a sprawling complex of buildings that had grown from a modest homestead into the headquarters of a cattle empire built on blood and corruption. If Jake was right, the evidence they needed to bring down Blackwood's entire network was sitting in his private safe, waiting for someone brave enough to take it. The moon was setting behind them when they finally reached the ridge overlooking Blackwood's property. Rose counted maybe 6 men moving around the buildings, guards left behind to protect the ranch while their boss was occupied with the siege at Henderson land. The odds were still dangerous, but manageable compared to the 18 killers they'd left behind. "There!" Jake pointed to a large stone building that stood apart from the bunkhouse and barns. "That's Blackwood's private office. The safe is on the 2nd floor behind a painting of his father." Rose studied the layout with the tactical eye her father had taught her. 2 guards patrolled the main yard, another was positioned by the corral, and she could see lamplight in the bunkhouse, where the remaining men were probably playing cards or sleeping. The office building was dark, which meant either it was empty or someone was waiting in ambush. "How do we get inside without raising the alarm?" she asked. Jake's smile was grim but determined. "We don't. We're going to make enough noise to wake the dead, grab what we need, and get out before they can organize a proper response." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. Rose checked her Winchester one more time, made sure her Colt was loaded and ready, and prepared to follow Jake Morrison into what might be their final battle. They hit the ranch like a Texas tornado. Rose came in from the north, her Winchester speaking with deadly accuracy as she dropped the first guard before he could raise his rifle. Jake attacked from the south, his Colt barking 6 times in rapid succession as he scattered the men by the corral and sent them diving for whatever cover they could find. The element of surprise carried them through the first crucial seconds. By the time Blackwood's guards realized they were under attack, Rose and Jake were already inside the main building, racing up the stairs toward the office, where the evidence they needed was waiting. Jake's hands shook as he worked the combination on Blackwood's safe, his fever making the numbers blur together. Rose kept watch at the window, her rifle ready as shouts echoed across the ranch yard and muzzle flashes lit up the night outside. "Got it," Jake breathed, pulling out a leather portfolio that contained everything they needed to destroy Marcus Blackwood forever. Bank records showing payments to corrupt judges, contracts with hired killers, geological surveys proving he'd known about the oil deposits for over a year, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger listing every person he'd had murdered to acquire their land. 17 named, Rose said, reading over his shoulder. 17 families destroyed for one man's greed. 18, Jake corrected grimly. He was planning to add the Hendersons to that list tonight. The sound of splintering wood from downstairs told them their time was up. Blackwood's remaining men had regrouped and were breaking down the office door. Rose and Jake had maybe 30 seconds before they were trapped in a room with no escape route and enemies closing in from all sides. That's when Rose Henderson did something that would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for the next 50 years. Instead of trying to escape through the window or hide behind furniture, she walked calmly to the top of the stairs and faced down four armed killers with nothing but her Winchester rifle and the kind of courage that legends are made of. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady as granite despite the overwhelming odds, "you're trespassing on property that's about to be seized by federal marshals. I suggest you drop your weapons and surrender." The men at the bottom of the stairs laughed, the kind of cruel amusement that came from men who'd never been challenged by anyone, let alone a young woman with a rifle. "Little lady," one of them called up, "you're outnumbered 4-1, and you're trapped up there with nowhere to run. Why don't you come down peaceful-like, and we'll make this quick?" Rose's answer was to put a 44-40 slug through the hat of the man who'd spoken, parting his hair and sending him diving for cover behind an overturned table. "Next man who calls me little lady gets it between the eyes," she announced, working the lever of her Winchester with practiced efficiency. What followed was the kind of gunfight that frontier newspapers would describe as epic and legendary. Rose Henderson, positioned at the top of a narrow staircase with perfect fields of fire, held off four professional killers for nearly 10 minutes while Jake gathered the last of the evidence they needed. Her shooting was precise, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire finally faded, three of Blackwood's men lay dead or wounded, and the fourth had fled into the night to spread word of what he'd witnessed. "Jesus, Rose," Jake breathed as they prepared to leave. "I've never seen shooting like that in my life." "My daddy always said that if something was worth fighting for, it was worth fighting well," Rose replied, reloading her rifle with hands that were steady despite everything she just endured. They made it back to their horses just as the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn. Behind them, Blackwood's ranch was in chaos, with wounded men crying for help and buildings burning from muzzle flashes that had set hay bales ablaze. Ahead lay the desperate ride back to Henderson Land, where Rose's parents were still holding out against impossible odds. The ride back was a blur of pounding hoofbeats and burning muscles as they pushed their horses to the limit across 12 miles of rough country. Jake swayed in his saddle, held upright only by willpower and the knowledge that failure meant death for everyone he'd come to care about. They created the final ridge just as the sun broke free of the eastern mountains, painting the Texas prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Below them, the Henderson Ranch looked like a military encampment, with trenches, earthworks, and that terrible cannon pointed at the stone walls where Rose had grown up. But something had changed during their absence. Rose could see riders approaching from the west, a long column of men in blue uniforms that could only mean one thing. "Federal marshals," Jake said, his voice weak but triumphant. "I sent word to Fort Davis before Blackwood's men caught up with me. Help was already on the way." Marcus Blackwood's voice boomed across the ranch yard, but this time it carried none of its earlier confidence. "Henderson, your time's up. Come out now, or we'll blast that house to rubble." Rose raised her Winchester, took careful aim, and put a bullet into the dirt 6 inches from Marcus Blackwood's boots. The cattle baron spun around, his face going white as he realized that his prey had somehow escaped his trap. "Marcus Blackwood!" Rose's voice carried across the morning air, like the call of an avenging angel. "You're surrounded by federal marshals, and we've got evidence of every murder you've committed. Drop your weapons and surrender." What followed was chaos as Blackwood's hired killers realized they were trapped between the approaching federal troops and two of the deadliest shooters in Texas territory. Some tried to fight, some tried to run, and some threw down their guns and begged for mercy they'd never shown their own victims. When the smoke finally cleared and the last shots echoed across the prairie, Marcus Blackwood was in federal custody, his hired killers were either dead or captured, and Rose Henderson was running toward the ranch house where her parents waited with tears of relief streaming down their faces. "Rose!" Margaret Henderson cried, pulling her daughter into an embrace that spoke of a mother's worst fears finally ending. "We held them, darling," Big Jim said, his voice thick with pride and exhaustion. "Just like you asked, we held them." Behind them, Jake Morrison was talking to the federal marshal in charge, handing over the evidence that would see Marcus Blackwood hang for his crimes and his entire network of corruption destroyed. Justice had finally come to Texas territory, carried on the wings of courage and the determination of people who refuse to be intimidated by money and power. As Rose watched Jake explaining the conspiracy to the federal authorities, she realized that her life had changed forever. The quiet rancher's daughter who'd started this adventure was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and more aware of her own capabilities. But more than that, she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. A partner who respected her strength, who'd fought beside her as an equal, and who looked at her not as someone to be protected, but as someone to be admired. The battle was over, but Rose Henderson's real adventure was just beginning, and this time, she wouldn't be facing it alone. 6 months later, Rose Henderson stood in the federal courthouse in Austin, wearing a deputy marshal's badge pinned to her riding vest. Beside her, Jake Morrison watched as Marcus Blackwood was sentenced to hang for 17 counts of murder, conspiracy, and corruption. The network Blackwood had built was completely dismantled, 12 officials removed from office, 9 corrupt lawmen imprisoned, and the territorial government cleaned from top to bottom. It was the kind of victory Judge Samuel Mitchell would have celebrated, the triumph of justice over corruption that frontier legends were built upon. But Rose's greatest satisfaction came not from seeing justice done, but from knowing she'd found her true calling. She and Jake had become partners in every sense of the word, professional and personal. Together, they'd brought honest law enforcement to Texas territory, protecting innocent families and hunting down those who preyed on the weak. The Pinkerton Agency had offered Rose an official position, making her one of the first female detectives in American history. The Henderson Ranch remained in the family, but it was no longer just a cattle operation. The oil deposits beneath their land would make them wealthy beyond imagination. But more importantly, Big Jim and Margaret had gained a son-in-law who understood their daughter's strength and independence. "You know," Jake said as they watched Blackwood led away in chains, "when I first got shot up on your land, I thought I was dying alone in the middle of nowhere." Rose smiled, taking his hand as they walked out into the Texas sunshine. "Instead, you found a partner who'd follow you into hell if necessary." "More than a partner," Jake replied, stopping to face her. "You found someone who loves you exactly as you are, strong, independent, and dangerous as a rattlesnake when crossed." Rose Henderson had started this adventure as a rancher's daughter, living quietly on the frontier. She'd become something more, a guardian of justice, a protector of the innocent, and a woman who'd proven that courage and determination could overcome any odds. But most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do, showing mercy to a wounded stranger, can lead to the greatest rewards. Justice had come to Texas territory, carried on the wings of love and tempered by gunpowder. And Rose Henderson had discovered that the strongest partnerships weren't built on protection, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the willingness to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. Some stories begin with love at first sight. Others begin with a woman finding a dying stranger and choosing mercy over safety. Rose's story proved that the second kind of love, forged in battle, tempered by danger, and built on absolute trust, was the kind that lasted forever. What would you do if faced with Rose's choice? Have you ever had to choose between safety and doing what's right? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear about the moments when you chose courage over comfort. If Rose Henderson's story of frontier justice and unexpected love moved you, smash that subscribe button for more epic tales from the Wild West. Your next adventure is just one click away. Until then, remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show kindness to a stranger in need.